Hello everybody, in this video series I'm going to be showing you how I made this Roubo Workbench. Okay, so in this video I'm going to be focusing on how I constructed the legs, more specifically how I constructed that massive joint that goes through the top of the workbench. So after getting everything roughly cut in the last video, I could take it across to the panel saw and get everything trued up, square and lovely and clean. So after getting the bottom of the legs all trued up, I then restacked them in the order that I established in the last video to do with grain orientation, and then brought those middle layers back to the panel saw to cut to their final length. The reason I kept them separate like this was essentially to minimise the risk of me cocking up. If I was to accidentally cut one of those outer laminates to the same length as the shorter laminate, it would render the whole joint useless, because like I said in the previous video, each of the layers needs to go through the thicknesser at exactly the same time, or the same bed setting without moving it at all. If one of them was cut short, I'd have to remachine it, which would mean it's not the same size as the corresponding layer, which would mean that I would have to remachine everything again. Hence why I took the extra precaution to keep it all separate. So here I'm marking out the location for the dominoes, roughly a 200mm spacing between them. And when fitting the domino, I decided to do one side nice and snug, and then change the setting on the domino to do the other side a little bit looser. And this not only helps with alignment of each of the dominoes, but also gives me a bit of side to side movement when gluing up the leg, and allows me a bit of wiggle room when flushing those shoulders at the top of the tenon, as you'll see me do later on when I apply the glue. So using the wiggle room that I accounted for when dominoing the components together, I used the stock of an engineer's square to flush off the bottom of the legs, and then was able to transfer the shoulder line from the shorter component across to the longer ones, and this made it extremely accurate and gave me a nice fine knife line to work to. So with the shoulder line square around each of the components, I could then mark for the offset of the tenon. This was at 20mm, which would give me a 20mm shoulder on the through tenon. There is a reason that I use this length, and I will explain that later on because it's far too difficult to explain it now. And after getting everything all marked out, I then raised the blade on the table saw to 20mm and cut 20mm into the shoulder of the tenon. And to cut the cheeks of the tenon, I also opted to do this on the table saw. You could do this on a bandsaw, however the blade tends to wander, so you're not going to get as clean and straight of a cut as you would from a table saw. The only issue is with a round blade is that it hits the bottom shoulder line before the top one. Hence why I'm just sneaking up on it and then bringing it back, double checking, going a little bit further, just making sure I don't go into the wood below. And this is what's left after the table saw. The only remaining cleanup is to take it to the bandsaw, trim off that excess to where the circular blade wasn't able to reach the shoulder line, and then take it back to the workbench to do some good old-fashioned chisel cleanup and get rid of those bandsaw marks. Here you'll see the difference between the bandsaw finish and the pristine circular saw finish, hence why I didn't go for the bandsaw to cut the tenon. And here's the through tenon attached to the middle layer. As you can see, shoulder line's perfectly flush, lovely clean finish, which is going to result in a nice crisp joint later on. Now here, I'm marking out for the wedges on the tenon, and the way this is marked out will probably surprise you because it's going to look extremely weak. Here I marked 3mm into the tenon, and at the top I marked 20mm in. I used a marking gauge to keep this nice and uniform between each of the different sections, and then linked up those two marks with a sliding bevel. So like I say, 20mm at the top, and that matches the 20mm of the shoulder line. And then really I should have used a angled jig or an angled guide to keep this nice and straight, but I just decided to do it freehand and follow the line on the bandsaw. Like I say, it goes right down close to that shoulder line, but it doesn't quite touch. The reason you cut them in this direction is so that the wood has a little bit of flex in it. If you were to do those wedges straight down, it's basically going to continue the split all the way down that leg. Having it go to a thin point gives you a little bit of flex in that wood. Obviously this comes across as being extremely weak, however, to put it into perspective, get a 3mm bit of wood and try and rip it in half lengthways, there is not a chance you're going to be able to do it. So like I said in the previous video, I did not have a lot of material left over when marking everything out, and this meant that this piece in particular was pushed up right against the bark line, and it sort of left this weird fluffy edge on it that broke off. To repair that, chopped it off on the table saw, gave it a little plane over with the low angle jack plane to get it nice and smooth, cut a new bit on the table saw to patch that, and then stuck it on with just standard glue and masking tape. To glue the layers together, here I'm using Titebond 2, although it's not what I would recommend for this, simply because Titebond 2 has quite a strong initial tack. It makes it a bit difficult to slide those components against each other to get those shoulder lines flush. Instead, I'd recommend using Cascamite because it's got a much longer open time on it, and also it's gap filling, which is great if you have any small gaps, not that I did, and yeah, it's just all round great for stuff like this, especially because of its longer open time. It just takes a lot of the stress out of it. At this point we were approaching summer, which meant that the workshop was starting to get a little bit toasty, so Titebond 2's working time was reduced to about 10 minutes, Cascamite was about 20. Despite it being a bit of a nightmare to mix up each time, I would rather have that open time and go through the extra effort than have a risk of glue drying before I'm able to clamp it up. So firstly I've got a few clamps on it just to bite it together, and then double check the shoulder lines were nice and flush, and then got some heavy duty clamps on it to close up the rest of those joints. Don't know if you saw earlier, but I was planing a small hollow between each of the joints to allow the outside of each of those layers to close first before the inside, and basically resulting in a nicer joint. And that's it for this episode. Obviously I haven't done the mortising at this point, and that's because I'm going to put that in the same video as when I do the tenoning, when I join everything together. The next episode is going to be constructing the workbench top and getting that all glued together, and yeah, see you then.